Welcome everyone to another session of the free MOOC on fundamentals of educational dialogue. And today we are very pleased to be joined by Professor Sara Hennessy, who's Professor of Education at the Faculty of Education, University of Cambridge. Sarah, could we begin with you telling us a little bit about your work with dialogue and dialogic education?
Yeah, sure. There's a couple of major projects that I've been involved with over recent years that I probably would sort of highlight. One is looking at the relationship between how dialogic a classroom is and the learning of the students in that classroom. So that was work I carried out with Christine Howe and Neil Mercer over a couple of years recently. And we found that indeed more dialogic teachers do promote learning gains in students. So that was quite gratifying. And the other work I've been doing has been with a resource pack called Teacher SEDA, which is looking at how we can analyze dialogic interactions in the classroom. And this is a resource for teachers. So we've been researching the use of that and how effective it is.
Okay, thank you. So could you explain a little bit more about your work around this idea of talk moves? What are they? How do they help us understand what is happening within a dialogic exchange?
Yes, talk moves are just the elements of talk that teachers or students might use that have a dialogic intention. So usually a move is a turn in speech or a part of a turn, and it would engage or attempt to engage another person in dialogue of some kind, particularly engaging with other people's ideas, or there could be a clarification of your own ideas in order to help somebody else understand your point of view. So examples might be building on others' ideas, respectfully challenging other people's ideas, sharing your reasoning, synthesizing ideas, those kinds of things. I'll just add that breaking down an exchange sort of into components like that it's insightful, but it's only part of the story. It's just analyzing at one level, but we also need to take a more holistic view to see how dialogue, gets built up over time.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is, as educational researchers, we look at both sort of the big picture of how ideas are developing in dialogue, but sometimes we also look at how an individual student or teacher is, what kind of activity they're doing. So if they are adding to, building on something that somebody else has said previously, then that is a particular type of dialogic contribution. Whereas if they're perhaps querying, questioning, or challenging what somebody else said, then that's a different type. So we kind of look for these kinds of things, and that helps us understand how dialogue is developing. So could you sort of explain why you think that there's a particular talk move which is building on or elaborating, and why that seems to, from your research, have a link to learning gains?
Yeah, certainly. Well, in our research, we actually found two different talk moves had a link to learning gains. So they had to be combined. So one of them was the one you mentioned about building on or elaborating others' ideas. Another one was one you mentioned earlier about querying or challenging ideas. But on their own, they weren't linked with learning gains. They needed to be in combination and ideally linked to student participation as well. So I can say a bit more about that, but basically, for authentic dialogue to occur, you've got to have a sort of dialogic classroom ethos where you might have ground rules that you've established that support everybody being able to participate and that support the development of thinking and reasoning. So that kind of classroom climate is crucial to sort of foster a dialogic mindset and a kind of ethic of respect for other people's views and the space and the opportunities to create those to promote sort of more dialogic ways of interacting. So once you have that climate, then those individual talk moves can have an impact. But isolated, they wouldn't have an impact. So you need the climate in place, the encouragement for student participation, and then those talk moves can act because they encourage that kind of engagement with others' ideas that is important for learning.
Okay, so I think from what I'm hearing, what you're saying is that it's actually the students participating in it and then using both these sort of approaches of reinforcing their own understanding by building on or elaborating something or taking it a little bit further, and at the same time either challenging their own understanding or somebody else's, which then helps them to understand whatever it is they're looking at in a deeper and in a better kind of way, so that their understanding then develops through those processes. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. And with that latter, the notion of difference is really important in dialogue. Exploring different perspectives. As one secondary student once said to me, if everyone agrees, there's nothing to talk about. You need that diversity of views, for sort of genuine dialogue to occur. But you also need the active sort of student participation to sort of support the knowledge building. I'd just add that it's important to encourage learners to make invitations to others, though, and that's something that we rarely see, even in dialogic classrooms in our research. So if teachers are watching this, then we would encourage you to encourage students in that way, particularly during teacher-student dialogue. They'll do it when they're working on their own in groups, but not when the teacher is present.
Right, so you're saying that it's a really positive thing when the students are asking each other to contribute and inviting each other to contribute, not just waiting. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so finally, what I wanted you to talk a little bit about is this idea of talking points. So why do you think that talking points might sometimes generate deeper dialogic exchanges than questions?
Well, talking points are just statements that are a bit controversial or a bit debatable. And usually we ask learners whether they agree with them and to just sort of discuss why that is. I think they're a more effective pedagogic tool than questions, because even open-ended questions imply that there is an answer. And after the answer is given, however long it takes to get there, the learners might think, well, there's no more to say. Whereas sort of the rich dialogue that talking points, effective ones, could stimulate, that can continue for longer. So the dialogue is rich because justification and evaluation of ideas are expected in the talking point mode of interaction, whereas in the sort of Q&A mode of interaction that we see very prevalent in classrooms around the world, a question usually needs the teacher to sort of introduce more follow-up questions to draw out the reasoning and argumentation, whereas the talking point dialogue can take off by itself. It has its own momentum.
Right, so I think that's really interesting. So what we're saying is that it allows the learners to sort of take a position and to think things through for themselves, as opposed to trying to find an answer. And so that opens up the kind of dialogic spaces or the dialogic exchanges. Okay, so
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That's been really interesting. I don't know if there's anything final you wanted to add, or but that's given us a very good overview of some of the work that you've been really instrumental in taking forward in the field of dialogic education. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll add one more point if I can, which is just that on talking points, the most sophisticated discussion around those would involve some kind of reasoned coordination of the ideas. So in other words, evaluating which ones have more merit. And again, this is something that we hardly ever see in classrooms, but it's an important way of moving learning forward. So again, it's something I would encourage teachers to think about.
Yes, I think, that sort of takes us onto some of the other coding, some of the other talk moves that you have identified, because it's building on, elaborating, querying and challenging, like those are kind of two groups of moves which are really significant. But we also know, as you're saying, that finding evidence of reasoning, of justification and of evaluation, that's a very strong area that you can then see there's a higher level sometimes, or a deeper level of dialogue going on. And then there's also the idea of synthesizing, coordinating ideas. So although these are things that are there in your work, what you found is that actually elaborating and querying are the key kind of building blocks. And then you can sort of, once that's students are really confident doing that and the dialogue starts taking place, then they can perhaps start becoming a little bit more aware of providing a justification or doing some of the other kinds of talk moves. So I think that it's great to sort of make people aware that there is more to it, and that if people are interested, they can sort of look into that as well. Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much, Sarah, for your time, and it's been a real pleasure listening to you talk about talk moves and talking points and the kind of things that you look for in classroom dialogue. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.